So I have had 2 double lung transplants because I was born with a genetic illness called cystic fibrosis, and both parents have to be carriers. 1 in 4 chance of having it. I am the 4th out of 4 kids, so I'm the perfect statistic. So I have lived with this illness since I was born. It's something that causes a lot of lung infections and digestive issues. For me, it was the lung issues that were the most troublesome in that they caused me to have lots and lots of hospital stays from the time that I was pretty young all the way up until the time I was in college, where my lung function was getting lower and lower, and I was having more and more difficulty needing more IV antibiotics. I was actually doing IV antibiotics most of the time while I was in college, and at some point it just became obvious that I wasn't going to be able to sustain that way of life. Mm-hmm. And so unfortunately I was put on a list for a double lung transplant when I was in my early 20s. Mm-hmm. I received my first double lung transplant when I was 26. That lasted for about 4 years, but unfortunately my lungs went into rejection. And so luckily for me, I was given a second double lung transplant, which at the time was sort of a rare opportunity, and certainly higher risk. So I'm extremely lucky to be sitting here now about 15 years after that second double lung transplant.
Wow.
Yeah, so 20 years total life post lung transplant as I sit here today.
And yet your journey still continues.
Yes.
So what's going on these days?
Well, one of the things that often happens with a lung transplant is that because of the fact that the medications we have to be on for immunosuppression are toxic to the kidneys, many of us end up with kidney problems, and I now have gone into complete kidney failure. So you see my little bandage up here. This is my port for dialysis. So I'm now on dialysis and hoping maybe to get a kidney transplant in the near future. You know, one of the crazy things about being a chronically ill patient is that it's really I want to say easy to have this dialogue inside of yourself about whether or not you're sick enough for a lot of things. Am I sick enough to drop out of college? Am I sick enough to say that I need to go on disability? Am I sick enough to say that I need to go into the hospital in the middle of a COVID-19 crisis? All of those kinds of conversations are things that I think a lot of chronically ill folks grapple with. My personal opinion is that when you're female, that's even more so, because there's this sort of sense of not wanting to be a burden to people that gets layered on top of the intellectual conversation. Mm-hmm. So I did grapple with that. I didn't want to burden the teams who were working with COVID-19 patients, or my team, specifically the lung transplant team, who I assumed would be called upon because they're pulmonary docs. So that was part of the quandary that I had. But again, I'm really glad that I did go in, obviously, because I was a lot sicker than anybody imagined from what I was telling them. And again, I was pretty close to the end there. So they had to begin emergency dialysis, and it was probably one of the rougher weeks of my life, which is saying a lot given what I've been through.
You have a high threshold.
Yeah, I have a high threshold for pain, I think, and for suffering, and it was a lot of suffering. But I think it was an interesting time to be going through that suffering and to be looking at down, once again, the barrel of end of life, because I was alone. And in the sense that in the COVID-19 early days, there were no visitors allowed at all. And so while my friends and family were happy to call me, I actually didn't really want to talk because I felt so bad. So I was really alone, other than the the nurses and the doctors who would come in and check on me. But when it comes to facing end of life, those are not necessarily the folks that you would talk to about what you're thinking and feeling. And when I would try to express it, like a couple of times I would say, well, because I have a tendency to sort of joke about things like that. So I would say something sort of silly like, well, I'm half one foot in the grave kind of thing. And everybody would go, that's not true. That is not true. And that doesn't allow me to then have a conversation about the fact that I really do believe that I have one foot in the grave. So that denial kind of that we have to try to, in a way, to be positive for our patients really cuts off dialogue.
Doesn't validate.
It doesn't validate, and it certainly doesn't make me feel welcome to share with you the fact that I really do feel like this could be the end for me. So there were a lot of moments and nights where I was alone with those feelings and those thoughts. And I guess the surprise for me was that that was really, really okay. What I've learned through this process and these 46 years of looking at this as an individual is that at the end of our days, no matter what that happens to be, whether that's from cancer or a car accident or kidney failure, you are going to be essentially alone because you're not going to be able to communicate everything that you're thinking and feeling, no matter who's sitting next to you. And the only person that you can really rely on to be there, to comfort you, to love you, to tell you all the things that you need to hear in that moment is you. And that is a beautiful aloneness. And that is an aloneness that must be cultivated ahead of time.
Given that you're relatively young, do you think that medical professionals did not really feel comfortable exploring all of the options about your care?
There's a lot of assumptions made about what people want in terms of, this idea that people want to live no matter what. And I don't know that people are really given the option to really think that through.
You actually have a choice.
Right.
Just like you got to make a choice about, and you were grappling with the choice about whether or not you even wanted dialysis if the day ever came.
Yes. Yes, I mean, that's a great example. This idea of shared decision-making that we talk about in the world of patient experience isn't always as transparent as it could be. So, for example, when my kidney started to fail, I was given two options, transplant and dialysis, but they left out the third option, which is death. And that's a valid option. And I couldn't decide if I wanted transplant and or dialysis without deciding first if I wanted death. Because if I wanted death, then I don't really need to explore these other options, right? And I'm young, but I've been through a lot. My body's been through a lot. And to say that I should go through more really invasive treatments is not fair, I don't think, to me. Mm-hmm. So I had to really allow myself, and once again, I was alone in doing so because nobody wanted to have that conversation with me, but I had to allow myself to go through that process of saying, do I want to live or do I want to die? And ultimately, I chose live, but with the caveat that any moment I can choose differently. I don't have to complete any of these journeys. I can go off of dialysis whenever I want to. I can say no to the transplant if that becomes something that I no longer want to do. None of these things are, a contract.
Why do you think we have such difficulty allowing people to contemplate death as an option?
Well, somehow we feel as though it's a failure, that we're quitters.
We don't do this, you'll die.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
In
true.
reality, we all will.
Yeah, we all are going to, and there's more peaceful ways of going, and there's more violent ways of going. And I think one of the things about medicine that we don't talk about is the violence. It's a violent thing that we do to our bodies a lot of times. I mean, getting a lung transplant, think about that. You're ripping out my lungs and you're putting in new lungs. I mean, that's pretty violent. If an animal attack did that to me, you would feel really sorry for me, right? But because it's done as a medical procedure, as a surgery, then somehow it feels safe and okay. But our body experiences that trauma, whether we call it medicine or not. And so we have to recognize that each one of those traumas is a big deal for the psyche and for the body. And we have to allow people to make those decisions about what level of violence they're willing to go through.
So what does that feel like when you're in the zone as being a patient, when you were in the hospital more recently and you weren't as strong externally and you were hearing things and seeing things but not able to participate? What do you wish healthcare professionals knew or did differently during that time?
I was honestly sort of surprised. This last hospital admission, I went from being a person, so because of my kidney disease, when I got to the hospital, I could not make sentences anymore. That's how sick I was. My mouth worked, but my tongue didn't. And I couldn't make sentences. My brain was so foggy, I couldn't find any words. And I also had these really strange sort of spasms in my limbs that were really upsetting for me. When I was in that state, where I was just mostly eyes closed, just trying to get through that moment, people were doing weird things, like slamming my gurney into the wall, slamming my chair into the wall, moving me as if I were this object. And then as soon as I got my speech back and my eyes were open again, suddenly I wasn't getting slammed into walls anymore. And I hate to say that out loud because I wish that weren't true. But I think it's an unconscious thing. I don't care about this person. I think it's just a not seeing that person
Lack of connection.
the same way that you see someone who you can relate to. And so I guess I would just go back to what I said a minute ago, which is the internal body isn't being reflected by the external impression that you're getting from someone. And just because their eyes are closed and just because they're not communicating with you doesn't mean that they don't feel pain, doesn't mean that they don't feel humiliation. That was humiliating for me, to feel like I was just this kind of piece of meat that was getting thrown against the wall. That was more upsetting to me than maybe anything. So I don't know how you keep that in the front of your mind as a person who works with patients every day.
So Tiffany, I'm going to cheat a little bit on our interview right now. We've been really talking about your personal perspectives, but I'm actually going to ask you for your professional one for a moment. Our industry's having a lot of discussion about health equity, particularly around people of color. Thoughts on this?
Right now, the conversation is about systemic racism in healthcare. Systemic racism in healthcare came about because of the way we built our systems. The system is actually working the way that it was built to work. So the fact that we have these outcomes with COVID-19, that we can clearly see that our people of color are not being served through our healthcare systems, is actually the system working the way that it was built to work. So how do we break that system down and redesign it with those who we serve so that they can then help us understand what the needs are, what the changes need to be, and how we can move forward from here and actually accomplish what we want to accomplish as a community. So listening as a, listening literally, listening as an individual, and listening as an organization.
So the near-death experiences that you had in your 20s versus the one that you had in your 40s, were they different at all as far as sort of your growth and maturity? Do you have different reflections of how that's changed your life moving forward?
Every time I've come close to the end of life, there's this great sense of everything's happening for a reason, which is so hokey. But I mean that very specifically. So, example, right before I went in the hospital was when COVID-19 was really hitting. And what I saw was perfection, order, purpose. This is not happening to us. This is not a punishment. This is on purpose for a reason, at the right time and the right place, because there's something that we have to do differently, or because we have to learn something. And I see that in my personal life as well. So everything that is painful, everything that is undesirable, lines up as a beautiful puzzle with complete order and purpose that is meant for me to do the puzzle, learn the lesson, grow, see the beauty of this universe, because nothing is permanent. Nothing can really hurt me. If death is the worst thing that can happen to me, then that's, as long as I'm okay with dying, then really it's all about just soaking it up and figuring it out and learning what this puzzle is trying to tell me. And for me, end of life, again, I've never gotten to the point where I was, taking my last breath, luckily for me. But I do feel like I've walked with one foot here and one foot on the other side. And that energy is not mine. That energy of seeing the perfection, seeing the puzzle pieces, that's not me. That's not coming from me. I know that is an energy that is coming from somewhere else. And it gives me a lot of perspective.
If there's anything that you could change about your experience, what would it be?
I think that's one thing I'd love to change in healthcare, if I could wave a magic wand, is this concept that when the body is weak, the person is weak. I think it's the opposite. I have seen my greatest strengths in my moments of greatest physical weakness. And to have people come in and judge me as weak in those moments feels very unaligned. That's not the right word. Discordant with my reality. My reality is I'm a badass, curled up in a ball, doing everything I can to hang on. And someone comes in and talks to me like I'm a baby, or talks to me like I'm dumb. And I'm like over here killing it, over here in my greatest level of concentration, my greatest level of clarity, my greatest level of grit. And to see me as weak is wrong. It's just wrong. And I don't think that matters. I don't think that changes if you're 89 and on your deathbed and taking your last breath. I think it's the same. So that would be one thing I wish I could change.